Good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining. It's Toro's second ever breakfast briefing, and today we're going to be talking about the security threat landscape of 2024 and beyond. So my name's Liv. I'm Toro's head of marketing, for those who don't know me. And I'm just going to be covering some boring housekeeping before we get cracking with the actual topic itself. So obviously, as you can see as you're joining, your mics and cameras are off, and that's just for your privacy. But please do use the chat function, ask questions throughout, and we will get to these at the end because we're going to be doing a Q&A session. And also just to let you know, today's session is being recorded, and you will be sent the recording at the end. And so today's speakers are Katie, who is Toro's Director of Cybersecurity, and Gavin, who is Toro's Director of Physical Security and Risk. So over to Katie.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us, especially for those of you who are suffering the infliction of half term at the moment. Appreciate it. Okay, just a very quick introduction for those who might not know us very well. Toro was founded in 2015 by our CEO, Pete Connolly, who, following a career in the military, was asked to create the UK's first red team penetration testing. And he did this by blending ethical hacking, physical intrusion, and social engineering to try and replicate the kind of attacks that we see from serious and organized crime groups and nation states. And once he'd created that methodology, his team were then tasked with attacking hundreds of businesses, from government departments to data centers, banks, corporate offices, in an attempt to identify their weaknesses. And what he discovered was essentially that the gaps were easy to exploit because most defenders take a siloed approach to cyber and physical security with human element overlaid across that. But criminals don't operate like that. Criminals exploit the path of least resistance, and they will combine cyber, physical threats, usually overlaid by human error. So this is where the idea of Toro was born. Peter wanted to build a company that thought more like the attackers and combined that cyber, physical, and people knowledge to give you as organizations a more holistic defense. So this is really relevant for today's webinar because, as you'll see, the threat landscape is not siloed. When we think about security, we consider things as a whole. We know that the threat actors will leverage physical, cyber, and people vulnerabilities, which means that risks will occur across all three of these domains. We are seeing the context for our security threat landscape this year and beyond playing out in the news every day. We've got global conflict, social division, and the impact of climate change all intertwined. This visualization, you can see we've referred to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2024 as a good source of information. And this ranks the following as the most impactful risks by severity over the next 2 years, so this year and next. And they are misinformation and disinformation, extreme weather events, societal polarization, cyber security, and interstate armed conflict, which will long-term be joined by extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and natural resource shortages. Essentially, we've got a hotter planet causing natural disasters, forcing human migration, This exacerbates conflict and war. It prompts border restrictions and causes global supply chains to falter. In turn, this leads to growing protectionism, reduced international cooperation, more localized policies and trade barriers, and from a tech perspective, ultimately restrict our access to innovation, because as nations, we become more protective of our technology advancements.
Thank you, Katie, for the great introduction. Now, economic downturn was also listed as the #1 concern over the next 2 years by many countries, including the United States, the world's largest economy, and the United Kingdom. Now, economic downturn is heavily impacted by extreme weather events, where the consequences of these natural disasters may deplete the economic reserves needed to mitigate and, of course, adapt to climate change. And this creates an even greater divide between what we call the global north and the global south, where those nations in the global south are often the most affected by extreme weather, often connected to climate change, which of course in itself is mostly attributed to the rich countries in that global north, where we have much larger carbon footprints. And this of course plays into a larger global societal divide, where the inequality of the global south is rooted in colonialism and imperialism from the global north, and is thought that today there remains an unequal exchange between those rich countries and those poor countries. Indeed, researchers conclude that the rich countries continue to rely on those imperial forms of appropriation from the poorer countries in order to sustain their high levels of income and consumption. So therefore, it's no wonder that we are seeing a decline in democracy, where authoritarian governments can play on a multitude of crises, from those extreme weather events, economic downturn, that ever looming global recession, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, imperialism and colonialism history, and that growing divide between the East and West as the United States, China, and Russia continue to challenge each other. And as human ability is advanced by technology, and we have access to far more information and resource, this is also an enabler for societal division. And this, of course, leads to distrust, conflict, and eventual separation. We've seen the effects of that throughout history. A recent report suggests the continued growth in technology may leave the next generation without a clear path to improve our human potential, our security and well-being, as all this constant upheaval starts to become the norm. We become desensitized in a way. A fear, or certainly my fear, is that our investment in human development and resilience is being diminished, where we have invested so much in that, certainly in the past decades. The growing volume of misinformation and disinformation and the rise of authoritarian rule will continue to diminish this. So if I pass over now to Katie, who will take a look into cyber insecurity.
This global conflict that we're seeing, it plays out in cyberspace. We've seen this in Israel and Palestine most recently, which have been dominating the news. And of course, Ukraine, where Russia's war has involved the most extensive use of hostile cyber operations by one state against another in recorded history. We're now almost 2 years into that conflict. And if you were watching BBC News this morning, you'll have seen that war fatigue in Ukraine is likely. And this means that Russian cyber and influence operations are almost certainly going to intensify in an attempt to demoralize the Ukrainian public and also degrade the external sources of military and financial assistance that Ukraine is getting from the West. On top of this, we've got upcoming elections globally, which may give rise to leaders who create further polarization. The US presidential election, for example, is likely to be a key target for Russia to try and manipulate public opinion away from Ukraine support. Also, on the other side of the globe, we've just seen the recent Taiwan election, which reported many cyber attacks. And because these cyber threats have no geographical boundaries, in many ways, they are more agile and progressive than those of us, companies, security professionals, and governments who are attempting to protect against them. So what we're seeing is tech companies have started to become geopolitical actors. For example, Microsoft has a program where they closely monitor conflict zones and they gather threat intelligence in an attempt to share this with the wider security ecosystem so that we can all become more aware and collectively enhance our defenses. But this is where the interconnection of those influence operations and cyberspace is evident, because cyber warfare filters down. It's intensified by misinformation and disinformation that proliferates across online social platforms, which Gavin will talk a bit more about in a minute. And it essentially enhances cyber attacks, which we know are going to increase over the next year or two. But not only are the number of cyber attacks increasing, but their intensity is being enhanced by the use of AI. So whilst AI will bring many benefits in innovation and automation, the threat posed by AI in conjunction with cyber warfare is that we are seeing an underground development of malicious large language models. I don't know if you've heard of tools like Fraud GPT or Worm GPT, which are being used by criminals to create malware. On top of this, the infrastructure to support things like large-scale phishing campaigns, which remains the #1 reason why companies get breached, that infrastructure is widely accessible now. And that ease of use and accessibility has widened the pool of threat actors. This has led to a resurgence in what we call script kiddies. So these are the low-level criminals with not amazing technical expertise, but they're vast in number and they are opportunistic. Combined with that side of AI technology, I've also thrown quantum computing into the mix here, because although the benefits will be evident, we'll see innovation and automation driven by this technology. It's also going to be increasingly regulated and policed by governments. So as organizations, we're going to have to navigate the use of AI. And quantum computing, which threatens encryption systems, and it will impact our technology systems, those that both run our institutions in the country and our own organizations, it's likely to be restricted by governments for a while, or simply by the expense, really, of having access to that level of computational power. It's going to be expensive. Either way, what both of these things tell us is that the pace of change is increasing. We are all running just to keep up. This shortens our technology life cycles and puts increased pressure on us as IT professionals to replace legacy equipment and systems. And as security professionals, reduces the time we have to assess the security implications of that rapid change. So either way, our attack surface area is likely to increase.
So let me now touch on societal polarization, extreme weather events, and economic downturn, and what we can expect from these three risks in the short term or over the next 2-year period. So what do we mean by societal polarization? My summarization of it is where the normal multiplicity of differences in a society increasingly aligns along a single dimension, such as creating a belief on us and them. As an example, when we look at factors such as income inequality, this often results in two different social groups, those from the high income and those from the low income. And that itself becomes a single focal point of that single outstanding difference, such as they are rich and we are poor, so therefore we are very different. And I believe shared values that we all strive to follow are now being diminished by this distrust, political polarization, and the driving economic hardships. So where are the threats and what will influence societal polarization? Well, it is suggested in the next 2 years, a wide set of threat actors will start to capitalize on the acceleration and the availability of synthetic content in false media. And this will amplify those social divisions, influencing ideological violence, for instance, and in some regions, political repression, as we're seeing now. And as mis and disinformation grows, so too will the growing distrust in all information. This erosion of trust can only deepen those polarized views, leading to greater divides in society. After all, I have to ask you, what should we believe against what can we believe? And whilst deepfake videos can be quite entertaining, and if any of you have seen Channel 4's Deepfake Neighbor Wars, I found them highly amusing, but in many ways also concerning. If you haven't watched them, I highly recommend that you do. And of course, deepfake also gives rise to impactful and untrue media. And this was recently demonstrated in the deepfake audio of the British politician Keir Starmer, where caught swearing at staffers. Did he? Really? The Indonesian elections, and you may have seen this on the news last night and recently, have shown a deepfake video of a former president and dictator being used to garner support within the presidential election campaign. Perhaps we should bring back Churchill. Distressing photographs showing victims of war and military hardware have been used multiple times for different conflicts. Technological advancements mean we'll soon get to the point where we're unable to tell the difference between reality and fake, if not already there. President Putin's military operation in Ukraine has witnessed a multitude of unfounded claims to justify the invasion, including ethnic Russians facing genocide, the need to attack US biolabs in the country, and of course, the constantly referenced threat to Russia from the West. We are now witnessing those ripple effects of the Ukraine conflict in Eastern Europe, where some former Soviet states are following in the Kremlin's footsteps on cracking down on independent civil society groups. The use of mis and disinformation in politics and conflicts is nothing new, but we are seeing a rapid acceleration in manipulated information. And as access to more able technologies increases, so will trust in information deteriorate. And that line between truth and untruth will further thin and blur. A real concern in the short term is use of misinformation to disrupt electoral processes, and where a crackdown on real or perceived foreign interference could then be used to consolidate existing controls in flawed or indeed hybrid democracies. And if we consider over the next 2 years alone, 3 billion people will vote across several economies, including United States, United Kingdom, and India, who all have very large economies. So therefore, robust measures will be needed to protect free speech and to combat mis and disinformation. And of course, Other states could also deliberately stimulate tensions to divert attention and resources to benefit their own agenda. Some of those frozen conflicts at risk include the Balkans, Syria, Kashmir, the Kurdish region, of course, the Korean Peninsula, and we're already seeing the impact of Iran's influence in the Middle East. And the world seems to be holding its breath towards China's interest in Taiwan. In recent years, we have seen a rise in civil unrest where Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and climate movements are all influenced societal attitude and political change. And all of those are influential to mis and disinformation. We have witnessed attacks on politicians and sometimes fatal. And we've seen social discontent in many countries where news cycles are dominated by polarization, extreme weather events, conflict, protests, riots, strikes, and of course, economic hardships, to name just but a few. And when we consider all of this, we must see that the vulnerability to societal polarization seems to be at its highest in recent history. So what does this mean for you and your business? If you work for a global business, regional divisions will be especially difficult to navigate, as your employees, customers, stakeholders, and suppliers are all influenced by different and potentially varied factions. And in that mis and disinformation environment, those can rapidly form and change. You might find new structures are starting to form within the organization, and sometimes around the nationalistic and ideological views, and may not be aligned with the organization's existing social structures and indeed its values. You might also find yourself caught in the middle of splintered governments, or indeed used as a pawn between nations. New governments are likely to impose new laws, and regulators could impose stricter standards. But unfortunately, these social divides, politics and conflict are not the only risk your business will face. So let's discuss extreme weather events. So the United Nations predicts there will be an increase in extreme weather and climate disasters during 2024. 2023 was the hottest year on record with an El Nino event. And this is where sea surface temperatures in the tropical Eastern Pacific rise to at least 0.5 centigrade above the long-term average, which is further impacted by human-induced climate change. And this together causes global warming. And if that sounds like a perfect storm, from what we saw last year, it most probably was. And this year, El Nino is likely to affect many Asian countries, causing extreme droughts and or floods. And drought is most likely in Central America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, and the Sahel. In the UK and Europe, 2024 is predicted to be even hotter than 2023. Extreme weather events reported across the globe throughout last year, resulting in numerous climate disasters, including wildfires in Hawaii, flooding in New Zealand, Italy, Libya, Peru, Chile, Haiti, and China, and droughts in Southern Americas and Spain. 2023 also witnessed the fourth most active Atlantic hurricane season, with 20 storms forming and 115 cyclone systems were formed within the 7 major bodies of water. And as you probably know, developing countries are suggested as being impacted the most by climate change. And these often poor and in-debt countries are unable to mitigate the effects of extreme weather, and they lack the funds, resources, and often the infrastructure to adapt to those extreme conditions. Indeed, research suggests many economies will remain largely unprepared for the impacts of climate change. And the ability of communities to adapt could become overwhelmed. With the scale and unpredictable nature of extreme weather events, and indeed some regions simply will not be able to cope. The continued extreme weather will also continue to heavily impact agricultural output and will be disproportionately severe in countries where agriculture accounts for the largest share of GDP. And I'm a great lover of chocolate, and unfortunately, we'll all be disappointed to hear that the price in cocoa is again set to rise. And this is due to the dry conditions in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, again attributed to El Nino. So what does this mean for you and your business? Extreme weather events might disrupt your supply chains, as droughts and low water have a major impact on inland water trade routes. And you may recall in the past 2 years seeing images of Germany's River Rhine drying up and commercial vessels unable to navigate what is their most vital inland waterway. Of course, storms will hinder shipping, flooding and fire hinders inland movements. Due to these impacts, your insurance premiums and your operating costs will again probably rise. Moving forward, you'll need to provide or prove climate commitment and your resilience, and there'll be a high demand and restrictions from regulators. Climate activists will continue to target you if your business is associated with climate change. Tactics and actions are expected to become more progressive and potentially violent as these extreme weather events have wider and more impactful consequences. The upcoming elections will also be a focal point for climate activists, as some parties are promising to draw back on existing commitments to climate actions. And we saw the effect Donald Trump had with the Paris Agreement, I believe, in 2016, and Rishi Sunak has also followed suit in commitments. Societal risks caused by mis and disinformation could impact on locations most affected by extreme weather events, as populations seek to point blame against businesses linked to climate change. Due to this, your employees, contractors, and suppliers could all be targeted just by association. And of course, if you do not have sufficient resilience mechanisms in place, you are then likely to be most impacted and potentially unable to adapt to this speed of change. There will need to be a greater commitment and financial resource made available to strengthen your supply chains and for you to prepare and rehearse your contingency and recovery plans. So now let's have a look at economic downturn. So those extreme weather events, which are attributed to El Nino, will continue to impact food production and logistics, driving inflation and causing costly supply chain disruptions. The continued conflict in Ukraine and current and emerging conflicts in the Middle East, with tensions over Taiwan, will continue to impact global supply chains and trigger energy spikes, with escalations in these regions likely to severely disrupt political and security stability, and of course, financial markets. Politics will remain a major influence of economic uncertainty. Elections in some of the world's strongest economies are expected to affect financial markets. Now, the US presidential election and European parliamentary elections could have unpredictable consequences on geopolitics, trade, and of course, and we're seeing this play out on the news, the conflicts in Ukraine and Middle East. The cost of living could resurge as the impact of elevated prices continues. Debt distress is likely to affect the public and private sector alike, as those higher interest rates amid a slowing growth will put a strain on debt loads. An illicit economy activity and a rising crime will likely increase as economic hardship and technological advances reduce job opportunities, and conflicts push people towards crime, radicalization, or even militarization. Over the long term, developmental progress and living standards will be at risk, with economic, environmental, and those technological trends challenging labor, their socioeconomic situations, upskilling opportunities, and income. And of course, all of these vulnerabilities will increase societal polarization. Whilst this is a relatively bleak outlook, the anticipated global recession has not yet materialized. Inflation did decline steadily during 2023, and growth did hold up under much uncertainty. But this said, the economic outlook remains uncertain, and predictions.
I was just going to say the UK economy was reported to have contracted in the last quarter. Just this morning it was reported.
Yeah, and this is, the UK recession, potentially going to recession, has been raised this week. So these conditions, economic conditions, are likely to get worse in the next decade. We're not going to talk about that today, though. So what does this mean to you and your business? Economic uncertainty in some of the world's largest markets and geopolitical developments will continue to create operating hardships and unpredictable risks. Those prolonged conflicts are likely to cause significant supply chain disruption, which will be difficult to manage and possibly ineffective in a rapidly changing and unstable environment. And economic downturns will cause greater inflation and operational difficulties. So, going back on the news, a good example this week is Tetley's Tea have announced supplies were much tighter than it would like amid the disruption in the Red Sea. So a brew could, God forbid, become a thing of the past. We hope not. How would we survive that, Katie? Politicians, governments, and communities may take a stronger stance against businesses as they seek to overcome these economic hardships. We could see more vigorous border controls, trade barriers, and localized policies. There could be more strident measures by governance to increase the availability and affordability of goods and services could widen the socio-economic divide within communities. Businesses themselves could be targeted by disaffected populations. If you are a small or medium-sized business, then you'll be more exposed and sensitive to slowing growth and elevated interest rates. Fears of recession have a spiraling effect on job insecurity and economic uncertainty. Staff will need to be more engaged and supported. Reduced consumer spending, where businesses cut costs and unemployment rises, creates a negative feedback loop, which is difficult to get out of. And this is impacted by slowing growth and elevated interest rates. So I'm really sorry to be the bringer of bad news. And of course, predicting risk is not a given. What we do know is that the next 2 years will not be easy for many businesses. So let me now hand back to Katie, who will talk through some of the actions you and your business can take to reduce your risk exposures.
So hopefully what you've gleaned from that is there's an awful lot going on in the world, and some of those big global threats will filter down and impact us on a day-to-day basis in ways that we might not expect when we are head down just trying to get through the day. What I'm now going to try and do is just give you some of our brilliant basic mitigation actions so that you can try and apply this potential impact of that threat landscape in a practical sense to safeguard your businesses. And this is what we think you need to be doing. First off, identify your crown jewels or your critical assets. So know what it is that you are trying to protect at all costs so that you can prioritize your controls. It might be data. It might be your own AI or machine learning models if you're developing these internally. It might be your intellectual property or the results of research that you've conducted. It might be critical infrastructure, suppliers, or people. once you know what it is that you need to prioritize your protection measures towards, then you need to assess how well your existing security protects those critical assets. You need to test your controls. And this means looking at the people in your organizations, your physical assets, maybe the applications that you're using to run your business, and the processes, the less tangible stuff that your business relies on, as well as the working practices of those who use or maintain your critical assets, and then what the impact would be if those crown jewels were compromised or destroyed. If you are utilizing your own AI-based large language models or machine learning applications, you want to try and identify where incoming data could be tampered with, for example. You also want to try and judge how any plans to deploy new technologies in your businesses, which you're being pushed to implement for innovation purposes, are going to add to your technical debt or your legacy burden. Because as we all rush to keep up with the pace of change, we've still got all of our old hardware, equipment, systems that will either need maintaining because it's being used still by the business, or will need decommissioning. And it's very easy to forget about that BAU stuff when the business's focus is just on the new, shiny, exciting stuff. And that puts greater pressure. So once you've got an idea of your assessment of your security controls in protecting your assets, you then need to plan to update them, basically. It might be that you need better policies and procedures internally. For example, detailing the safe and compliant use of AI in your business. You might need to investigate your cloud supplier relationships or any supplier relationships and try to reduce single points of failure if possible. It might be that you need to build relationships with the regulators or your ESG teams if you're in a bigger organization, so that you understand what needs to be implemented to better protect your assets. You'll have noticed we mentioned supply chain multiple times throughout the context of our security threat landscape, and this is really key, we think, this year and beyond. So we've included an action to evaluate your supply chains. Essentially conduct a risk assessment so you understand where you rely on your suppliers and whether they might be disrupted by such things as climate-induced natural disasters or local conflict, regional trade disputes, or international regulations. Once you understand how your supply chains are connected, you also need to understand what their security stance is. And it might be that you need to identify backup suppliers, for example, so you've got more resilience. Finally, we think it's really important to support your workforce. Ultimately, there are still people at the end of the day trying to protect your organizations. It might be that you can better use threat intelligence to understand what's coming and how it might impact you. And this will inform your quicker response to threat events as they materialize. But you also need to be sensitive to those cultural divisions that Gavin spoke about when he was thinking about social division. Because if you have a large workforce, you might see different behavior and management style might need to adapt to ensure that you get best out of your people, who can either be your greatest asset or your biggest threat. If we are going to see a lot more operational interruption, your teams are going to be put under pressure because you've probably resourced for a nice, gentle BAU. And as soon as we see increased incidents, disruptions, I mean, even just the advent of all the technological change, it's going to put your teams under more pressure. So that resourcing point is going to become more important than ever before. Ultimately, there needs to be a focus on operational and business resilience. And we're not being paid by the regulator here. Organizations that will prosper are those who can plan, prioritize, and adapt. And that's going to be challenging. But this is how we think you need to do it. That's all I've got, but I think we've got a few questions.
Thank you, guys. We've got a few questions. I'm aware that we've only got 4 minutes left. So if we don't get through everyone's questions, we will reach out to you with the answers to them after the webinar is finished. So we've had a question in from Sadie Morris. We're struggling to keep our security staff due to many of the issues regarding these various threats. We'd like to offer them training to keep them, like a progressive training package. Does Toro offer ways to train those brilliant basics? Maybe even combining physical and cyber training you talked about. Also, how can I make my business more resilient to cyber, which is linked to a proper certification?
Katie,
Mouthful.
well,
Hey,
yes, we
hey.
do. A lot of our training packages are blended. That's what we do as an organization, and we deliver a lot of training on cyber physical integration, as well as situational awareness management and crisis management. And I'll now hand over to Katie to talk about the cyber element.
Yeah, I mean, I think related to certifications, what we normally do with organizations is identify whether there is a certain standard that you need to meet, whether it's something better recognized in your industry or something that you need to meet certain commercial contracts, and then use that as the foundation, as your framework to guide any improvements that you make. So if we think about these brilliant basics, when we're testing those controls or assessing what controls you have in place, we'll always refer back to a standard. There's no point reinventing the wheel. It's just about understanding what's relevant and proportionate for your business, which goes back to your critical assets and the context, essentially, because you won't be able to implement everything perfectly. You'll need to prioritize based on what your most critical assets are. So then we'll use those frameworks, those cyber certifications, to drive that program of improvement, so that you'll achieve both things. Essentially, you'll become more compliant in line with recognized standards and certifications, but you'll also be practically improving your cyber controls and your resilience.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got time for just one more. So I've got a question. What can Stratcom professionals in Central Eastern Europe take on board for their elections in 2024? With EU elections and some national coming, and the most advanced measures were some AI regulations, but there's little communication about global climate affecting the situation. On the other hand, those countries may not be the main target for climate migration. What's the best language strategy to choose? I realise there's only 1 minute, so that's a big question.
So I'm not a strategy comms professional. We do have one in Toro, so I'd rather ask those. But as a very quick, short answer, I would be projecting future risk. So, you know, as you state, the climate situation isn't currently affecting, but it could do. So if we look at the short-term risks, look at the longer term over the next 10 years, because that will probably start to come out and take effect. And then relate that back to your policies, how you're measuring the risks against your policies and the objectives that you need to maintain within your strategy and communications.
I mean, I think that's a great question. There's loads to talk about there. So I think we should definitely follow up on that one with our wider Stratcoms team.
Perfect. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today. And if anybody else has asked a question, we'll get back in touch with you over email with the answers to those questions, because I'm just conscious of everyone's time. But thank you so much, Katie, and thank you, Gavin, and thank you to everyone that joined. Our next breakfast briefing is going to be on the ISO certification. So make sure that you're following Toro on LinkedIn and you'll get the notifications for that.
That's ISO 27001.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
perfect. Have a good day all. Thank you.